Thank you again, Rob and Senator Kane. Throughout today's session, we're going to use an audience response system to gather feedback from you all, take questions, and do a little evaluation stuff too at the end. So take out your phones. Let's do a brief demonstration so everyone knows how to use it, get you comfortable with the tool. And while we're doing that, we'll ask our panelists to come forward. So Ashley and Sherry and David Safafian, who's talking to Senator Kane in the back. Uh-oh. So how energized are you feeling this morning? This is one of our warm-up questions. One being, I'm sort of on life support, could use a little help. 3, somewhere fair to Midland, as my grandmother used to say. And 5, I am on fleek, and if you are, we need to know how you are. We need some of that. So we'll try to get to maybe 30 or 25. Let's do 25 responses. So far, it looks like we're feeling great today. I can't see the number on the end. A couple more. So you guys are pros at this thing already. Let's go to the next question. To help our speakers learn a little bit more about who's in the room, so you 20 some odd, I think that's 30% down there at the end. See me afterwards so I can get some of what you have at 5. We're ready to go to the next question? More again? So to help us know a little bit more about who's in the room, which type of criminal justice agency employs you? Oh, and it cut it off. There should also be an other, and yeah, I don't work in a criminal justice agency. We're happy to have you anyway. We love you too. Great, just a few more. And we'll try to make 25, 28 our target. And one more question in our warm-up, get you familiar with how it works. What role do you play in reentry? Indirect, you support those doing the work. A direct role, reentry is your jam, as the young people in office have told me. You're exploring your role in your work now, or some combination of the above. Great. This is very helpful to know who our audience is for the day. My task now is to get us started talking more deeply about the recommendations. I want to pause for just a moment and beg your indulgence. We were going to have a speaker, Heidi Christensen, also a Community Family Life Services Speakers Bureau participant, to speak with us about health challenges today. But sadly, Heidi passed away quite unexpectedly just yesterday. And Ashley has been kind enough to come and share some information about the health challenges of the women that she serves in the Community Family Life Services. But I met Heidi, and she was just a very lovely person. I can say without reservation that my thoughts and prayers are going out to her family and friends. It will be definitely a loss. And Convergence, Carrie, is going to make a donation to Friends of Guest House in Heidi's honor. So we have here to speak Ashley David Safafian with the American Conservative Union Foundation, Sherry Davis, another Speakers Bureau participant, and Mark Levin from Texas Public Policy Foundation. And the way this is going to work is the Community Family Life Services Speakers Bureau participants are going to put a context around the challenges that are faced by currently and formerly incarcerated individuals, sharing their story, but also pointing out where systems and services miss the mark in terms of meeting their needs. And our reentry ready stakeholders are going to follow them by putting a real fine point on the kind of services and solutions that are available and called for in our report in the form of the recommendations. And I see two other stakeholders here that I didn't see before. I thought I saw Manon Butler, there she is, and Lars Troutman. So welcome and good to see you both. Sherry, thank you in advance for sharing your story with us. But Ashley, we're going to begin with you. Just talking about some of the health challenges of the women that you serve at your program.
Okay. So I just want to read just a few words of give voice to Heidi's story. She was coming here to talk a little bit about her health challenges. And she wanted you to understand that many women come into the prison system with wounds that are visible and invisible, and that the criminal justice system doesn't really deal with either. She suffered with multiple health challenges as a result of years of addiction, and they were exacerbated by her incarceration. Poor prison diet, lack of health records, and a complete disinterest in her health outcomes. She described how she was in need of a medical procedure while in prison and the challenges and barriers to getting the care she needed, often an issue of systems that crossed but did not communicate. She struggled with emotional and mental health needs as a result of her abuse and how it was unaddressed until she was released from prison and began to take responsibility for her life with the help of programs that were gender-specific and trauma-informed. She was in need of housing and found refuge at Friends of Guest House in Alexandria, Virginia, and later she joined the Speakers Bureau, where she continued to build her connections to community. Cross-collaboration, such as those discussed in the Reentry Ready report, would have significantly improved Heidi's incarceration and reentry experience. Successful reentry requires, and I'm pulling this from the Reentry Ready report because it fits so appropriately, successful reentry requires strategic collaboration of multiple overlapping systems working in concert to help individuals achieve their reentry and life goals. And we run into women every single day who are dealing with the issues of health that the criminal justice system ignores and doesn't address at all. And it almost looks like they're not even believed that they're having these health challenges. And, you know, we experience that quite frequently. And I believe that if we were communicating with other actors, that we would be able to address this issue. And so, you know, the report really does highlight how important, and it's a life or death issue, that systems are communicating.
Can you talk a little bit about your work with DC Department of Health around HIV and AIDS and some of the domestic violence work that you're doing as well? So,
you know, we target women's reentry at Community Family Life Services, and one of the things that we address and we know is that a large percentage of the women that we serve are at risk for contracting or spreading HIV. And so we, you know, provide medical case management so that women can adhere to a treatment plan. Because again, when you are, you know, dealing with trauma and you are in transition, it's very difficult to address your ongoing health needs. And so we try to provide a safe environment and supports that women need in order to be healthier.
Thank you. Mark, in the report, you all, the Reentry Ready stakeholders, outlined 2 key strategies as it relates to physical and behavioral health. And when we say behavioral health, we're talking mental health and substance abuse. One is that we need to increase the scope and quality of the services that are provided, and very closely related, expand treatment capacity and effectiveness. Talk a little bit more about these strategies, and in your work at Texas Public Policy Foundation, how have you seen them played out in states and communities?
Sure, and again, we're all very sad at the loss of Heidi, but I think hopefully today we are able to, you did a wonderful job giving voice to her experience, and I hope that we can use this, as well as Senator Kane's excellent remarks, to really advance the recommendations in this report. We do talk about a number of health issues, and perhaps it starts with assessment to provide an individualized examination to determine what someone's medical needs are, both physical and mental. And one of the things that's very important to keep in mind is that we haven't mentioned today is a lot of people reentering from both jails and prisons. There's actually more people coming out of jails, but obviously shorter stays on average. But many of them are not on parole. They're not on post-release supervision. So we have to find a way to get these services, including medical and physical and mental health services, to folks even who are not under supervision. And so that's one of our challenges as well, to address the entire reentering population. But in addition to assessment, I think case management, which was alluded to earlier, is very important, and that can kind of be the solution to the fragmentation of the system that Senator Kane mentioned earlier, because someone who's just leaving a correctional facility doesn't have, in many cases, the wherewithal to navigate many different providers. I mean, the healthcare system is very confusing for even those of us who haven't been incarcerated for years. So that case manager can make those connections. And I think one of the other issues, of course, is coverage. In Texas, one of the things we did in 2017 was we addressed this issue of people's benefits being terminated as soon as within, in some cases, a day or two of them being arrested and put in a county jail, and instead said if it's 30 days, for the first 30 days, their names are not to be reported by the sheriff to the federal government. And by the way, sheriffs actually get money from the federal government for every name they report, but to have their federal benefits, which can be Medicaid, veterans benefits, et cetera, terminated. And then if they are in jail more than 30 days, there would be a process within 48 hours. They could automatically have their benefits restored after leaving jail. Obviously, people in jails and prisons are not eligible for Medicaid or other federal benefits while they're incarcerated. But the key is when we get to the continuity of care issue, particularly someone who has severe mental illness, if they're not able to get those medications immediately after leaving a correctional facility, we know that their chances of relapse and recidivism are going to be much higher. So, and then one of the issues we also mentioned in the report is electronic health records, and having a single formulary, so that there is this, if somebody goes from one jail to a prison, or from a prison to a treatment program, lots of different parts of the system, that this all can follow them, their electronic health records, and that the drugs can match up so they don't have to have a whole new prescriptions and so forth. So I think that's one of the major challenges. We start with assessment, and then we maintain continuity at all their stops in the system.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Let's transition to talk a little bit about education and employability. So I hope you all are noting your questions in your mind, jotting them down, because we'll leave plenty of time for that. When we talked about education, the stakeholders made a deliberate decision to call it employability and not employment, because a part of the challenge that many incarcerated and formerly incarcerated individuals face is acquiring the skills that they need in order to be employable, and to acquire both the hard and soft skills that they need to become employable. Sherry, when we first met, I was struck by your story about wanting to make the best use of your time when you were incarcerated, and how it didn't quite work out the way that you had planned. Tell us a little bit about your story and how maybe what you had planned didn't quite prepare you as much for time after incarceration.
Right, thank you. Good morning. I never expected to find myself here today talking to you about the inadequacy and insufficiency of educational programs offered while incarcerated. In fact, all my life I had heard just the opposite and witnessed many friends and family members come home to job opportunities because of the training that they received while they were incarcerated. So when I was sentenced to 48 months, I was determined to use my time to learn a new trade. First thing I did was download the prisoner's handbook for Alderson Federal Prison Camp, where I would be serving my time. And on page 30 of the handbook, it lists all the work opportunities and apprenticeship programs. And each program was about a year long. So I was planning to enroll in the cooking, the electrician, and the cosmetology apprenticeships, which would have taken me right out the door. But once I arrived at Alderson, it didn't take me too long to figure out that the information in the handbook was incorrect. I was faced with too many obstacles to count. There was no cooking course offered at all. There was no electrician apprenticeship because there was no licensed instructor. And the cosmetology instructor had been laid off due to budget cuts, and the prison was scrambling trying to figure out how the students who had started the program would be able to finish. So instead, I took classes like chess, scrapbooking, healthcare coverage when you're released, nutrition, portrait sketching, one-stroke painting, Get Fit Buddy, parenting and step families, Get Your Credit Right, Reentry, poetry writing, creative writing, cartoon writing and drawing, trauma and life workshop, and anger management. I received certificates in all of these programs for classes, plus learned to crochet, but there was no waiting jobs for me in any of those fields. And these are the types of programs and courses available to me and countless others like me while incarcerated. I ask you, how can I make a career out of or take care of my family from scrapbooking, portrait sketching, or playing chess? It hit me that without adequate resources, I'd end up back in prison. The lack of resources are a major contributor to recidivism, and educational offerings for incarcerated women fail in comparison to the educational offerings for incarcerated men. And this is why we need better educational programs in prison. Now, after I was released, my first order of business was to find a job. But my new criminal history status made that next to impossible. And I must have applied to over 1,000 jobs. And I have 2 master's degrees, but I couldn't get a job at Safeway bagging groceries. So there were very few reentry opportunities available for women. Eventually, I found the Department of Employment Services Project Empowerment Program that provides training and work experience through internship opportunities for returning citizens, which led me to the Georgetown University Pivot Program that offers returning citizens opportunities to start their own businesses and more work experience, which led me to the Speakers Bureau. The training I received at the Speakers Bureau provided me with the necessary tools needed to be here today and provide testimony about my personal experiences with the educational courses offered and received while I was incarcerated. And this is the call to action. There are 2.3 million people incarcerated in U.S. prisons, all receiving the same inadequate education. How long until it affects someone you love? We need better programs. We must have better programs. Thank you.
Thank you. So in the set of recommendations that our stakeholders created, we call for, in the education and employability space, programs and services, comprehensive cross-system collaboration that for individuals during incarceration and upon release. And in the full report, you'll see all the details on the differences that they make between what happens during and after incarceration. But David, when we talked a couple of days ago, you gave some hope that there are some things that are happening now that could help to address some of the needs that Sherry described so eloquently. Tell us a little bit more about those and connect them to the recommendations that are in our report.
Sure. Let me first start by saying how proud I was to be part of this project, and thank you for involving me. And let me just put a fine point on what Sherry pointed out. I'm the General Counsel of American Conservative Union, but I am also an ex-offender. And I spent roughly 9 months in a lovely gated institution in Massachusetts where the extent of programming was watching Nat Geo and the Discovery Channel and the History Channel and calling that learning. And it was pathetic. And to put a finer point on it, it is amoral. Strike that. It's immoral the way we handle education in prisons, plain and simple. But I do feel like there is some light at the end of the tunnel, and for once it's not an oncoming locomotive. Senator Kane pointed out that there is now more bipartisanship, maybe even nonpartisanship. This maybe isn't any longer a right versus left issue. And if you look at the economy, companies are really desperate for employees, and it's sad that it takes desperation for people to open their eyes up to the value of returning citizens as employees, but I'll take a win where I can get it. So let me just give you guys a glimpse of something that we've been working on that drives this sense of hope. So we worked, a number of us in this room, Mark, others, worked on the First Step Act. Overcame huge numbers of obstacles, political, policy, and other, and we got this bill passed in December. And the way the bill was drafted, there was a technical flaw, and the technical flaw was the application of a retroactive good time credit. And we don't need to go down that rabbit hole, but we all expected it to kick in almost immediately, and lo and behold, because of a technical drafting error, it's not going to kick in until next month. The result is that we're going to see a small spike, 2,200 ex-offenders or soon-to-be ex-offenders who are going to be released on top of the normal 10,000 a month coming out of BOP. And the White House jumped in, and they wanted to make sure that every one of those people coming out had a job opportunity, had all of the preparation that at least we could reasonably muster so that they had a good chance for success. So what does that mean? Well, Jared Kushner, and I think Senator Kane flagged this as well. Jared Kushner has taken a personal interest in this, and he's driven this to the point where we saw 150 major employers and countless numbers of smaller ones come together and pledge to hire ex-offenders. We saw that they got the Social Security Administration to figure out ways so that when men and women are leaving the door, they got their Social Security cards so that they could go out and get a driver's license. We saw them lasso in the private sector on any number of areas, including telecommunications, how to get a cell phone, subsidized, reaching out to some of the ride-sharing companies in order to get them a credit so that people can go to job interviews. And they really did, what I thought was fascinating, and it was before our report became public, they really did take a silo-smashing, cross-collaboration approach. They had public and private. They had representatives from all kinds of agencies involved, and it was all being, centralized isn't the right word, but managed or organized by 5 people working for Jared. We're going to see how this works out next month. the seeds are there, but we're still facing a lot of resistance. And let me just give you an example. We have the Society of Human Resources Management is going to have a desk officer in every state so that a returning citizen coming from any judicial district can pick up the phone and find out who's hiring. We have information on how to go about getting all of the things you need to prepare for that. We could not get that to any of the 2,200 designated first step ex-offenders, or we're struggling to do that. We can get them to unit managers at prisons. We are getting them out to the 94 judicial district parole officers, but we can't get them actually into the hands of the ex-offenders. OPM has been asked to adjust its online job recruiting site so that there are additional online tools for people coming out to apply for a job with the government. If they don't need a certain security clearance, I mean, there's no reason why these folks can't come out and work for the government just like any other employer. It's all online. BOP will not let that information, that access into the system. So, you know, we're still facing these institutional hurdles. But what I saw in this was just a glimmer of people waking up and going, okay, it's not just this person's responsibility or that agency's responsibility, or worse yet, it's not just the private sector's responsibility. People are starting to recognize and go, it's everybody's responsibility to help these folks. Maybe it's out of the goodness of your heart. Maybe it's because you're faith-based. Maybe it's because you don't want folks to come out of prison and reoffend and potentially create another victim in another case in another prison cell. But for whatever reasons, people are starting to realize that this is not a lock them up and throw away the key environment. This is not an environment where our primary goal is retribution and penalty. It is public safety and human dignity. So today's a good day. We'll see whether end of July is still a good day, but I'm hopeful.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So just a quick applause before we start questions.
Thank you.
And we have a hand. Is that a hand for a question or a good stretch? Hand for a question. Excellent. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Troy Burner.
Good morning.
I'm here for sure, but I'm also a returning citizen after 25 years, 7 months ago. The question is, I know Mr. Swenson, we talked a couple months ago, remember? Okay. But we know each other from inside when Core Civic was CCA. And I'm going to pose the same question to you that I asked him a couple of months ago. And the situation is, in CCA, at that particular time, there was a program that I was in, home building maintenance and repair, that I was a month from finishing, and I got locked down, and I missed the last month of the class, so I wasn't able to finish the class. As he know, the reason I was locked down was not my fault, but there was no incentive for me not to go to Hole, and I lost out. Now I'm going into speaking on what Ms. Davis speak on. Being here now, I've heard of various people having the issues. I applaud the convergence efforts and everything, but it's still an issue. I was fortunate enough with the timing to come out, and I'm also just graduated from the Georgetown Pivot Program.
Congratulations.
Thank you. But in the process of being there and maybe having the training and necessary skills to be successful in society and going to such programs and graduating from such programs that I have, you still having these issues with people finding employment. And I just want to know what we understand that is a problem. And again, I applaud your efforts in taking the step to all the steps for all the stakeholders and everything to, make it a little easier for everybody.
Right.
But at the same token, it's still an issue. So I'm saying now that we've identified how widespread this issue is.
What are we going to do?
What are we going to do? And maybe this is an uninformed question, but we're speaking of, or is being spoke of, having all hands on deck and everybody being involved in bringing this to fruition. Where are the actual returning citizens that can be identified to? Because if we start and review Convergence or whoever, the government or whoever, and there's an issue with us not being a part of what's going on, then therefore, what can we expect from the organizations, the employers, the landlords? What can we expect?
So you have like 15 questions in here. Let me try to boil it down to. Let me try and boil it down to just two things and give our panelists an opportunity to respond.
Yes, ma'am.
So one thing I heard is, and any of you can comment, is how can we incentivize employers to hire returning citizens? That's one.
Yes, ma'am.
And then a second part of your question I think I heard is around how to, and it's embedded in one of the recommendations in our report, that if you start something when you're on the inside, what can be done to build that bridge so that you have an opportunity to finish it when you return home.
Yes, ma'am.
So if the walls of jails and prisons were a bit more porous, and maybe folks that were coming from out the programs and technical education training that's available outside, they were the same providers that were providing services on the inside, you might be able to, go back and forth from one to the other. So let's hear from our speakers on both of your questions.
Yeah,
okay?
Can I say, those are great points, and even something like mentoring, or being able to complete that same certificate or educational program at a community college and continue the day you go out. That is, all the research shows the reentry programs that combine the inside out approach, and there's a seamless transition. That is critical, and that's kind of what we tried to do with Safe Streets and Second Chances, where we're piloting that now in 4 states. But the other point I think you make, which is really good, is that the conditions inside of prisons in many cases don't lend themselves to a lot of these programs. And so you can have these programs on paper, but of course, it sounds like you perhaps were in solitary confinement for a period and you couldn't access the program. I mean, the people that are in that quote lockdown, they're not, in most institutions, they're not able to continue with any programming. And believe it or not, there's actually some prison systems that release people directly from solitary confinement, which is a terrible approach in terms of recidivism. So many prisons don't actually have the programming space as well to deliver a lot of programs. But you also have units that are on lockdown for whole days on end where no one can participate in programs. So we have to redesign many of the correctional facilities. We have to implement alternative disciplinary approaches to the use of solitary confinement. And we have to, for those people that are still kept in a lockdown, so to speak, we have to find, whether it's through technology or other means, a way to deliver programming to them.
And as a side note, the BOP in a lot of places, I'm, again, recent release former juvenile lifer. So if you don't have an effective release date or parole date within the last 5 years of what they're offering, then you don't get it. So therefore, you may be in a position where whatever's happening with your situation to be released, but because you don't fall into that 5-year plan, then you go without getting the skill.
So you must have read the report while we weren't paying any attention, because that's one of the things, one of the recommendations that is contained in the report, that you early on, as early as possible in your period of incarceration, that you receive an assessment and that a plan is created for you that would extend the entire time of your incarceration and connect you and create that warm handoff so that you continue what you were doing while you were on the inside and make connections to the resources that connect to the learning that you had, the learning you need to continue, the skills that you developed, and employers that are on the outside. So it's in there. Thank you for raising all of these points. And I want to make sure that we get to the second question that you raised about incentivizing employers, because that's something that we heard a lot in the interviews that we did in preparation for the project itself, that there are resources available in communities and their employers, landlords, we'll talk about housing and such in a few seconds, that just don't seem to care enough. And one of the things that we spent a lot of time talking about at the stakeholder table was how to incentivize people to behave in different ways as it relates to this population. So what can we do to incentivize employers to hire formerly incarcerated individuals?
Well, I would say the best incentive right now is the economy booming where they're desperate for workers. There are some incentives built into the current system, workforce development, tax incentives for hiring ex-offenders. The challenge you have, to be candid, is is finding the right balance so that we're incentivizing workers, but we're not mandating the employment of workers, because I think that's when you get into some real sticky issues from the employer side. I actually would take it a slightly different direction and say, the issue isn't about employers not wanting to hire ex-offenders per se. The issue is about public attitudes about ex-offenders. And one of the things that came up during a number of our discussions was really the scope of the issue, right? Depending on the study you look at, between 1/3 and 1/2 of America, maybe 20% and another look, have some sort of criminal record, right? And we know that roughly half of America certainly has had a mother, father, brother, sister, son, or daughter incarcerated. Everybody just about has been touched by the scope of the problem in the system. Yet nobody talks about it, right? I think there's this sense of shame almost. We don't want to, I'm uncomfortable talking about it. I hate talking about my background. And if folks started talking a little bit more about their personal experiences and interactions, it would take some of the stigma out of being formerly incarcerated and hiring the formerly incarcerated. And I think that's on, it's a cheap way to say it's on all of us, but if we don't, if we let the shame kind of box us in and cower instead of speaking up about the problem, then the people who are from the lock 'em up and throw away the key camp continue to win. And the people that have no use for ex-offenders continue to win. And the people that just view human beings as disposable continue to win. So I don't know, that doesn't really squarely answer the question. I don't, what incentives we can put in place to help ex-offenders find the jobs. I think one of the big ones that we did talk about in the report was eliminating some of the restrictions on hiring ex-offenders, the occupational licenses. This is a massive problem. Louisiana, I talk about it all the time. You need a license in Louisiana to be a florist. And if you don't have, quote, good moral character, close quote, you don't become a florist. And it's nothing more than a sham to protect florists, right? So what are we doing about that? Well, I'm arguing regularly that the Federal Trade Commission should be working to strike these things down as anti-competitive. Arizona finally did one good thing right on criminal justice. They passed a bill that said if some other state has licensed you, we'll accept that licensure, and it's a way to kind of get around some of these obstacles. So, making people more eligible, I'm not sure that's great grammar, but helping people by removing those barriers and helping employers by removing those barriers would be a huge step as well.
We have a question.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Dawn Freeman, President and CEO of the Secures Foundation. I actually just wanted to piggyback on what you said, David, and one of the things that I subscribe to for our organization is community engagement. One reason why, I think employers are afraid to really take a chance on someone who has a background is they don't really understand what takes place. Contrary to popular belief, and I understand the federal prison system is somewhat different, but not every agency is lacking on programs, especially in state systems. Quite a few of them do offer, a lot of programming, maybe not so much in a jail system, but in states I know they do a lot. But employers or community partners have no idea because they're not exposed to it. They don't go in. And so I think bridging that gap and opening the door for community partners and employers to go in and see the work that is taking place at an agency will also help to bridge that gap and make it easier for people who are returning home to find employment locally. Additionally, just my last comment is that I totally agree that there is a level of storytelling that does matter, so that people can see that you can be formally incarcerated or justice involved and be articulate, be educated, and someone that they should take a chance on and give you an opportunity because you can be a valuable asset. And I'm also a person just like similar to you. I've never been incarcerated, but I am justice involved. And that's something that I've now learned to be proud of, that, regardless to whatever my early years were like, look at who and what I've accomplished now. That's something that, I think more people should applaud and see.
Yeah, and I know, Mark, you want to chime in. I don't want to paint with a broad brush, right? My family business, I'm not part of it, but my family business back in Michigan is desperate for workers. It's a manufacturing business in the auto sector, and I actually connected my uncle, who runs a family business, to Michigan's vocational village, and it's an amazing source of talent. And my uncle was here for the White House event a couple of weeks ago, talking about employment of ex-offenders, and he said, these guys come out and they're motivated, and they're afraid, and the fear in this regard is actually a good thing. They don't want to be the first person to mess up, because they know that if they mess up, the guys behind them in the pipeline won't get a job. And so that actual sense of kind of community and accountability and fear works to our advantage in this. So, and I know that there are other programs, Leanne, I'm sure you guys have some great stuff in North Dakota. So I don't mean to paint a broad brush, but I would also point out that while BOP itself, I think is fair to say, has a horrible track record on education and reentry. You look at some of the other alternatives, some of the contracted organizations, and I don't want to go down that get into that debate about private prisons and anything, but I can tell you that my experience and my seeing it firsthand is that some of those are much more attuned to creating this continuum of care, right? That is training and healthcare and things like that helps folks transition a little bit smoother.
Go ahead. I think one of the things that gets lost or missed when we start talking about employment is that we fail to acknowledge the experience that women are having that are barriers to employment that have nothing to do with employment. If I'm someone who's suffering through a trauma and I'm trying to heal from that trauma, it doesn't matter if the employer is open to hiring a returning citizen. I need the kind of supports that don't exist for me. And until we acknowledge that women who are returning from prison need a specific set of supports that take them to job readiness, then it doesn't matter what you do with an employer. It doesn't matter what the incentives are and what the pays are. We've tried all of those things, but trying to deal with a woman who is healing from abuse or trauma or addiction, employment can't happen until those things are resolved, and rarely are they addressed in the context of employment.
last comment on this
Sure.
panel?
Well, transportation is certainly a key factor. Actually, we just passed a bill in Texas, 1 million driver's licenses restored, so we're even doing a little bit more than Virginia, but that's important. But of course, in Arizona, they're giving folks, and now with Kim Kardashian's initiative, ride sharing, because not everybody's going to be able to buy a car as soon as they're released from incarceration. But another one is keeping a job. I mean, I think that one of the issues that we hear a number of people have who are formerly incarcerated is relating to a boss, you know, the interpersonal skills, and that's the type of training, in addition to the actual skills themselves, that we need to make sure people have, and we need to have that support for them. So if they have an issue with their boss or their employer, that there's someone they can talk to and get advice, so that they are able to retain that job. So that's very important. And then litigation. We found one of the issues that we heard from employers and landlords is they're afraid of being sued for negligent hiring or renting to someone with a criminal record. So we did pass legislation in Texas that protected them from that type of litigation.
Thank you very much. Join me in thanking David, Sherry, and Mark. Ashley is going to stay seated for a second to talk about the next set of recommendations.